heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and I might just start off by saying this is a live broadcast. It's amazing how many of the radio stations I've been listening to and different talk stations either are running a tape on this day before Thanksgiving or have maybe a guest host, and this is a live program, and I thought it worth a mention of that, especially as I went into one facility nearby here where I have another office, and there was nobody there. Well, a security guard and some receptionists, and the cafe was shut down, and it was pretty quiet everywhere. And so I let myself in and let myself out, and so I'm beginning to wonder if things have changed dramatically. Just a few years ago, I remember we sometimes would do a program the day after Christmas. I remember Penna Dexter and I sometimes would come in and do that Black Friday particular broadcast. One, because it sort of was a good setup for Christmas and year end, and of course we'll be talking about the fact that next Tuesday is Giving Tuesday, December 2nd, and we already have a banner on the website, but there were just a lot of good reasons to do that. And then we eventually said, well, there's not much going on, and that's not the case, as we'll talk about today. Quite a number of things. Matter of fact, an executive order signed by the president, which I may or may not even have time to get to, that will affect you and your lives in very significant ways. And so all sorts of things are certainly relevant. And so we are doing a live broadcast today on Wednesday, and I appreciate both of the Megans for being in here to make that possible. I know they didn't have a choice, but I still appreciate them both being here to help out. Let me real quickly also give a disclaimer. And that is that even though we've been really talking about Thanksgiving, and I do want to point you to a very good piece by William Federer yesterday, Bill Federer, as well as, of course, one that we did the week before with Jerry Newcomb. Have also today even have the Thanksgiving quiz, kind of an annual tradition that we have, where if you want to use that quiz around the Thanksgiving table tomorrow, that's all there. But today, it just so happens we're going to be talking about some more difficult things. Just an accident of programming. The first one we're going to get into is the issue of anti-Semitism, but there's a positive in that it's referred to by Philip Klein as Ted Cruz's finest hour. Next hour, we're going to get into the history of African Americans in America. As I've said before, if we're going to talk about the 250th anniversary of this country, we also need to talk about some of the dark chapters in American history. So we will have Robert Woodson with us as we talk about, I just used his book that's been around for many years as the jumping off point, Red, White, and Black, Rescue in American History from Revisionist and Race Hustlers. So we'll get into some of that. So in a few cases, we're going to be talking about some negative issues. But if we are going to be grateful for the country that we live in, patriotic about America, we have to be honest about some of the issues that are part of our history as well, whether it's our history in the past with racism or our current history with anti-Semitism. With that as a background, let me just mention that I have produced two booklets on anti-Semitism. The most recent one I really updated, if for no other reason than after the attack by Hamas on Israel, I began to see that once you started having people actually protesting in the streets supporting Hamas, maybe we need to evaluate some of those arguments as well. But the first article here is certainly very well written by Phil Klein, and he says, Senator Ted Cruz is trying to wake people up to what he sees as a growing crisis on the right. He is taken to saying that if he were to post good morning on the social media platform X, within minutes he would be deluged with hundreds of blatantly anti-Semitic replies. You might think, oh, of course not. But he says that's not much of an exaggeration. On Veterans Day, Senator Ted Cruz, again, senator from the state of Texas, like most elected officials, posted a graphic with an accompanying note expressing gratitude for the brave service members who fought for our nation. The message was totally uncontroversial, but you got one after another very anti-Semitic kinds of comments. I will not read them on the air other than simply to talk about the death cult of Zionist, Jewish terrorist, the evil political Zionist takeover. Those are the best comments. Then referred to Cruz as a shill for Israel and controlled by Israeli masters. And you go, what? This is the reaction on Veterans Day. And of course, as he points out, Ted Cruz is no stranger to being an object of derision, going all the way back to when he, as a rookie senator, led a lonely crusade to defund Obamacare. But these attacks are directed at him because he's a Christian who has been a leading advocate for strong relations with the United States and Israel, and a fighter against the scourge of anti-Semitism. Now, Phil Klein points out that other political leaders have spoken out in recent years about this, but Ted Cruz has distinguished himself at every opportunity, he says. Ted Cruz raises the issue without being specifically asked, unlike politicians who are willing to attack anti-Semitism only on the other side. Cruz is fighting it on all fronts and considers it a poison. He says now cynics may dismiss such remarks as pandering to specific audiences when he spoke to the Republican Jewish coalition, but he's taken the message elsewhere. He points out the Federalist Society National Lawyers Convention expected him to speak about the First Amendment. He took the opportunity to highlight the anti-Semitic problem, and we had Holly on recently who happened to be in the audience of that convention and talked about that as well. And you've had Mark Levin, you know who Mark Levin is, said that Ted Cruz is a righteous Gentile in that he's not just principled, he's courageous. And there are very few politicians, Mark Levin said, in either party who are speaking out against what is the most pervasive and ubiquitous anti-Semitism that I've ever seen. And Ted Cruz, in the interview he did with Phil Klein, even points out the fact that he says, I think we're facing an existential crisis in the conservative movement. And I want to learn basically what he's saying, if I can paraphrase him, from what has happened in the Democratic Party, who just simply said that was confined to some kind of fringe of individuals. And he went on to say, I don't want to be in a country where both political parties are dominated by bigots and anti-Semites. And so I've resolved that the only answer is to defeat this poison. It is to stand up, take it on, head on. I believe this is a time for choosing for every elected official, for every journalist, for every commentator. And then goes on in this article to talk about, of course, when he was interacting with Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz was interacting with Tucker Carlson, and Carlson again was bringing on such people as Nick Fuentes and others. And I think it was very interesting that Ted Cruz made it clear that I'm not against free speech and open speech. Matter of fact, I'm all for it. But he says my complaint about Tucker Carlson having Nick Fuentes was not that he platformed him. That's a choice you make or not make. But the last time I checked, Tucker Carlson actually knows how to cross-examine someone, which of course he did when Ted Cruz was on the program. So this one goes on for many pages. It's a 5-page article. I have maybe not done it justice, but there are other things I want to get to. But I thought it was very helpful to recognize that we are being told that we have to speak out whenever there is anti-Semitism, whether on the left or on the right. And let's at least give Ted Cruz credit for the fact that indeed he has done so, and I hope others will follow his lead. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Thanksgiving is tomorrow, and I suspect that you are doing lots of things to get ready for this special day. Let me suggest you add one more item to your to-do list. Visit our website and download a copy of my Thanksgiving quiz. Thanksgiving is a wonderful time to gather as a family, but I also believe that it can be a great time to teach our children and grandchildren about America's godly heritage. I created this short quiz to be a conversation starter around the Thanksgiving table. You know, we used to go around the table before the meal and ask our children to tell us what they were thankful for. After a few years of hearing about how they were thankful for their cat, their doll, their video games, I knew we needed to do something else. The Thanksgiving quiz was born out of that frustration. It has 19 questions and answers on the Pilgrims and the Mayflower Compact, as well as some questions and answers about the Christian heritage of America. Who were the Pilgrims and why did they leave Europe for America? Why did they celebrate Thanksgiving? What is the Mayflower Compact and why is it significant? What lessons did the Pilgrims learn about work and even free enterprise? How did the Christian faith influence America? These are just a few of the sort of questions that you can ask around the table and give short answers. Perhaps it is time to recapture the importance of Thanksgiving. On the bicentennial celebration of the landing of the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock, Daniel Webster declared the following: "Let us not forget the religious character of our origin. Our fathers were brought hither by their high veneration for the Christian religion. They journeyed by its light and labored in its hope, and they sought to incorporate its principles with the elements of their society and diffuse its influence through all their institutions, civil, political, or literary." It is my hope that this quiz will help your family see the importance of Thanksgiving. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Wednesday edition today, A Point of View. And again, if you would like to find out some of the material that we're covering today, these have been posted. You will see the piece by Ted Cruz, or actually by Phil Klein about Ted Cruz. This one I'm going to look at from Matt Vespa, why they call people fascist. And then we'll get into some issues of the deep state, including a case before the Supreme Court that you need to know about. Talk about what might be called the evils of capitalism, really the false arguments against capitalism, which brings us into, of course, the discussion of socialism. So I just got a bunch of odds and ends along the way that we'll get to as well. But first of all, this piece by Matt Vespa was a reminder that just as we see people calling, Jews all sorts of names, and they call anybody that supports Israel all sorts of names, we for some time have seen various individuals using the fascist term, and we're going to continue to hear that, by the way. It's not going to go away. And I thought it was interesting that there was an interview the other day that Matt Vespa actually gives you, and you can watch it for yourself. But first of all, he says, these jokes write for themselves. Here's a blue-haired former Antifa man being interviewed. Okay. But the question was, why are these individuals that are Antifa, that organization that supposedly doesn't exist, why are they and many others referring to people as fascist? And I thought it was interesting, his comment, because this former Antifa man said, they don't kill you because you're fascist. They call you fascist so they can kill you. And in some respects, one of the questions was, well, how's that different from a group like ISIS? Again, he went on to say, they don't kill you because you're fascist. They call you fascist because they can kill you. It's meant to dehumanize you. And as a result, if they want to actually have a justification for what they want to do, and something else which we have not talked about, but I've been sharing some articles back and forth with my producer, Steve Miller, that maybe we need to find a way to do it, is the really significant rise in the gun culture on the far left. And a lot of those are trans individuals who are going to gun ranges and shooting and learning about guns and all sorts of stuff because, number one, they have accepted this idea that their life is in danger, which is a canard that is presented many times in these meetings, but then also the idea that because these people might be threatening to us, we have a right to kill them. And so as a result, Matt Vespa points out that once you have this idea that, hey, we don't kill you because you're fascist, we call you fascist so we can kill you, this is, in a sense, the result of the brainwashing that has taken place, and then ties to the attempted assassination or assassinations of President Donald Trump, of course, the murder, the killing of Charlie Kirk, even the attacks on federal agents and immigration and customs enforcement. Goes on to talk about a facility, which, as I pointed out, not even 9 miles away from this studio where we are right now, which actually was shooting individuals and had anti-ICE messages on the bullets. And also, he points out how quickly the story died as soon as the information was revealed. And so this is a reminder that when people are using the term fascist, they're not just using it as a label because they think you are. They may even know that you're not. But they're using it because it helps to dehumanize you. And if you don't see a correlation between the first article I talked about, anti-Semitism, dehumanizing Jewish people, and the second article there about calling anybody that you disagree with, especially people that would have a conservative or Christian viewpoint, fascist, well, I think you can see the obvious implication of that as well. Let me real quickly pick out just a couple of small items because I want to get into a bigger one after the break. And the first one has to do with a conversation we had just the other day. But I know that some people tune in and tune out. And as much as we love the various productions by Ken Burns, Civil War, jazz, baseball. This latest one, we only have seen the first episode, so more to come. And if this is a preview of coming attractions, we're going to have some problems because, as I pointed out the other day, Dan McLaughlin raised the issue. Now Rich Lowry has as well. The Iroquois Confederacy was not even a democracy. Leaders were selected by women elders whose status was hereditary. You might go, what's that all about? Well, if you watch the first episode of The American Revolution, which is, of course, on PBS and is also a book, and I mentioned I've been thinking about getting the book, although sticker shock. The book is $80. Now, again, I'm a member of Barnes & Noble, so I guess I can get a discount. So they're thinking maybe I can get this hardback book for $40, but I think it's about time to get it because let me hold up another booklet. The booklet we put out just recently on One Nation Under God reminds you where these ideas come from, especially when you go into, of course, you get my booklet we also produced on the Federalist Papers, but we know where these ideas came from. They didn't come from the Iroquois nation. They came from Montesquieu. They came from Locke. They came from many other writers during what was called the English Enlightenment and that kind of period. These were ideas that were in the heads of George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay, Patrick Henry, you go John Adams. The list goes on. And yet, if you watch the first episode, it instead is a very concerning because, as Rich Lowry points out, few documentary films have the moral and natural authority of a Ken Burns production. And I think very highly of him. And I even told my producer if there is any possibility to interview Ken Burns, I would love to do so. But now I've got a few other questions than I had before we saw the first episode. Because as Rich Lowry points out, Ken Burns implies that the Iroquois Confederacy, a union of 6 Indian tribes in New York State, was what influenced the founding of the United States. I'm having trouble even saying this with a straight face, but okay. That's how the film begins. You know, the narrator intones, long before 13 British colonies made themselves in the United States, the Iroquois had a union of their own and then also a democracy that flourished for centuries. Okay, first of all, it is true. The Iroquois Nation, not trying to be anti-Native American here, did have a confederacy. But let's face it, we had Greek city-states that had confederacies all the way back in 478 BC. So let's not look at that. And again, regardless of how influential or non-influential the Indian tribes were, as one scholar, Robert Nadelson, has noted, and he is a historian of some regard, he said the word Iroquois doesn't show up in the 34-volume Journals of the Continental Congress, the 3-volume collection of the records of the Federal Convention, in other words, the records of the Constitution Convention, or in the 40-volume documentary history of the ratification of the Constitution. So the concern, as he ends, is, well, so it goes, in elite opinion, 250 years after the greatest event in modern era. So we do have some concerns about that. I have thought about maybe it would be time to seriously think about pulling together some of the individuals that we've interviewed over the last 2 weeks and other individuals as well, and maybe have a roundtable discussion after we've seen some of this American Revolution material. But if nothing else, it underscores why I produced this little booklet on One Nation Under God, why we have a Patriot Pact that has One Nation Under God, one on the Federalist Papers, one on the Bill of Rights, one on constitutional interpretation, one on the Patriot Pastors. There is a real need to try to present accurate history. We're going to do that today when we talk about, of course, the history of African Americans as well, and to also include what, again, a secular liberal like Ken Burns is probably not going to add, and that is the Christian influence and all of that. So that's just enough for, if nothing else, a little bit of a disclaimer. I would encourage you to watch the series. If you want to go spend, I guess it's $80 if you get it in the normal bookstore, but if you actually are one of the individuals that gives to and gets a membership with Barnes & Noble, I guess you can get 50% off, still a $40 book. Anything we can do to teach history, but if we're teaching inaccurate history, I am dedicated here, and I know many of our guests that have been on this program are dedicated to teaching the accurate history of America. With that as a background, let me just mention that we have posted these 2 articles already that you can read. We're going to get to some more in just a minute about a very interesting case before the Supreme Court, which brings us back to the concern of the deep state and Operation Choke Point and a number of other things, which I'll get into in just a minute. But as you go to the website, you will see my Thanksgiving quiz is there. We have, of course, a take action item, which you probably have reacted to, and the banner. Just a reminder, as I sent out today in an email, that we have a goal on Giving Tuesday, next Tuesday, and you might be thinking right now about what you would like to give, not only to this ministry, but to other ministries, including the radio station that carries this program. Let's take a break. When we come back, I've got a lot more to cover. I'll do my best right after these important messages.
I have a little nutcracker decoration that counts down the days, and it tells me that Thanksgiving and Christmas are coming fast. But you know, so is another special day, Giving Tuesday, December 2nd. People around the world are going to take part in this annual tradition of showing generosity in the middle of a season that's often marked by busyness and consumerism. It is so easy to focus on what we need in our own life, but I encourage you, pray about what you can give this Giving Tuesday and consider partnering with Point of View. By partnering with Point of View this Giving Tuesday, you'll be part of a mission to give truth to America in a time when it's desperately needed. Mark your calendar so you don't forget to give on Giving Tuesday, December 2nd. Or you can give anytime by visiting us online at pointofview.net or calling 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net, and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again
is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, one of the other booklets are going to hold up is on the deep state, and we've talked about that before. And one of the reasons I did this booklet years ago is because some people said, well, there's not a deep state. And then, of course, as the Biden administration was leaving office, the Washington Post was very concerned about the deep state that might exist. As a matter of fact, they were first concerned before that about Trump having a deep state that would affect Biden. And, of course, now people have been worried about the Biden deep state. But there's a bigger issue, and that is Congress has been tried to respond to some of the ways in which unelected bureaucrats are having an influence. And what we're going to hear in just a minute is some back and forth having to do with a case in New York where you had a financial regulator that was actually influencing, the word they use is jawboning, banks and insurance companies to cut off the National Rifle Association. Now, this is part of what was called Operation Choke Point. In the Biden administration, for example, if we said we don't like guns, well, we can't get rid of the Second Amendment, but we can make it really hard for people to actually sell guns. Then you had Operation Choke Point 2.0, in which they said, not only do we not like guns, we don't like cryptocurrency. And if you saw this interview the other day, you had Eric Trump saying that his family was debanked by J.P. Morgan Chase, by Bank of America, by Capital One, all because of some of the things they were doing. And that's why he got interested in Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. He said we were canceled like we were dogs. You got another individual as well who is an individual that has been a proponent and was then asked what he thought about what, again, J.P. Morgan was saying about Jack Mahler's ministry and business and organization. And he said, what do I think about Jeffrey Epstein's banker being concerned about a distributed, decentralized, open public money? And so you also, and of course, by the way, he's been recently debanked, which some people are calling Operation Choke Point 3.0. Within his background, though, the question was raised by the Second Circuit Court of Appeals whether or not this regulator known as VULO, you'll hear that name in the piece that comes from the back and forth on the Supreme Court, whether this individual, whether she had qualified immunity. And a lot of people are saying when you give this kind of qualified immunity to a bureaucrat who can then pressure banks, pressure insurance companies, essentially maybe to drive you out of business, that's of concern. So I thought for just a minute, we're going to take you into the oral arguments. It's a little difficult to figure out who's asking each question. Ketanji Brand Jackson asks a question. Justice Sonia Sotomayor asks a question. You have some response from a number of individuals that were arguing the case. So it's a little difficult at each point, but I think you get the idea that what we're talking about here is a really important case because, as I've said before, if they can debank the Trump administration, if they can debank the Trump family, if they can debank some of these very prominent individuals, they can debank you. If they can go after your family and the president's family and some of these other individuals, you can see the potential danger. So let's go into a little bit of the oral argument and the presentation that was taking place before the Supreme Court.
Government officials are free to urge people not to support political groups they oppose. What they cannot do is use their regulatory might to add "or else" to that request. Respondent VULO did just that. Not content to rely on the force of her ideas, she abused the coercive power of her office. In February 2018, she told Lloyd's, the insurance underwriter, that she'd go easy on its unrelated insurance violations if it aided her campaign to weaken the NRA by halting all business with the group. Lloyd's agreed. 6 weeks later, she issued guidance letters and a press release directing the thousands of banks and insurance companies that she directly oversees to cut off their ties with the NRA, not because of any alleged illegality, but because they promote guns. In the accompanying press release, VULO's boss and co-defendant, Governor Andrew Cuomo, said he directed VULO to issue the guidance because doing business with the NRA, quote, sends the wrong message, unquote. Shortly thereafter, VULO extracted legally binding consent orders from the NRA's 3 principal insurance providers, barring them from ever providing affinity insurance to the group ever again, no matter how lawfully they do so. These actions worked as multiple financial institutions refused to do business with the NRA, citing Vullo's threats. This was not about enforcing insurance law or mere government speech. It was a campaign by the state's highest political officials to use their power to coerce a boycott of a political advocacy organization because they disagreed with its advocacy. Governor Cuomo essentially conceded as much in 2 tweets responding to this lawsuit, in which he said, and I quote, "The regulations New York put in place are working. We're forcing the NRA into financial jeopardy. We won't stop until we shut them down. It's time to put the gun lobby out of business. Hashtag bankrupt the NRA." At the motion to dismiss stage, the only question is whether these allegations, taken as a whole, plausibly plead a First Amendment claim. Because Vullo chose coercion over persuasion, they do. I welcome the Court's questions.
Okay, so that's just the presentation. But again, we've given you, if you would like to watch it in its entirety, or actually listen to it, this comes from our good friends at Just the News, and you can see then the back and forth, some of the questions that are raised after that initial presentation. And again, just to give you some context, which I probably should have before we got started, this was oral arguments that were heard a year ago. Now, after that point in time, this is why the NRA, the National Rifle Association, has asked the Supreme Court to again review a case, review this for a second time to really establish whether or not this unambiguously unconstitutional act by this individual was something that deserves further action, because after all, the First Amendment prohibits coercing a disfavored speaker's service providers to punish or suppress disfavored speech on her behalf. And one of the briefs came from the Institute for Justice, who we've talked with on this program, in which they accuse the Supreme Court of recently and repeatedly pronouncing that the judiciary should defer to the legislature on whether to provide damages remedy for constitutional violations, while again inventing a real source of the constitutional disease. A lot of legalese. Again, I'm not Kelly Shackelford. I'm not a lawyer. I don't play a lawyer on television, but I can tell you what is going on here. And that is, you have individuals in the deep state who are making decisions. They're unelected individuals. They have very significant regulatory power, and as a result, they can sometimes, just by threatening to use that regulatory power, bring about some actions which, if were done in a court of law or done in a particular congressional action, would be seen as inappropriate, maybe even unconstitutional. For those of you that are saying, well, didn't we have a case recently? Yes, we did. The other side is surfing some of their concerns, and that is, you might remember that the FCC commissioner said to ABC, either we can do this the easy way or the hard way. And all of a sudden, ABC said, maybe we need to take Jimmy Kimmel off the air for a day or two. And these kinds of actions, whether from the left or the right, whether under the Biden administration, where it was happening all the time, or this one singular case now in the Trump administration, but there will be more, just illustrates again the problem with the deep state, and all the more reason why the Supreme Court needs to address this issue. So I thought, if nothing else, I would help you understand that just the conversation they're having there has to do with the fact that Jack Muller's the other day, he's actually debanked from J.P. Morgan Chase. I guess probably he could have seen it coming, because he referred to J.P. Morgan Chase as Jeffrey Epstein's banker. But he's not the only one, because as I mentioned just a few days ago, we also now have Senator Ron Wyden, a Democrat from Oregon, who is the top Democrat on the Senate Finance Committee, who is now calling for an investigation of J.P. Morgan Chase because of suspicious transactions that they allowed and underreported by Jeffrey Epstein. this thing gets worse by the day, because we're not just talking about individuals that are connected to Jeffrey Epstein. We're, of course, talking about probably the most powerful bank in America tied to that as well. And the report filed suspicious activity reports, and so there is going to be an investigation, and this was something that was proposed by Senator Ron Wyden, who, by the way, is a Democrat, but nevertheless pointing out these very significant reports. And this report calls not only on Congress, but the Justice Department to investigate the bank. So this issue of Operation Choke Point is still out there. It's surfacing in a variety of different ways, and it's just an illustration of when we first started talking about it, we thought there was more. It's like an iceberg, 90% underwater, and we're learning more every single day. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention next hour we're going to be talking with Robert Woodson. He is the editor of this book, Red, White, and Black, Rescuing American History from Revisionists and Race Hustlers. He has written an essay in there, but there are all sorts of other essays from individuals that have been on the program where we've quoted from John McWhorter, Clarence Page, Wilford Riley, Shelby Steele, Carolyn Swain, to mention just a few. So I think you will certainly learn a great deal from that. And if you want to get a copy of the book, it's been out for some time, but we have a link so that you can find it there as well. But just before we wind down, one of the issues we're going to be addressing more and more is the issue of socialism. Just as we think it is very important for us to tell America's history in terms of the American Revolution and America's godly heritage, we think we're going to really have to focus on this issue of socialism. So you may have seen in the past my little booklet I'm holding up on socialism. Those of you that are already part of the Truth Team will be receiving this booklet coming soon, which is called The Road to Serfdom, which is, I think, one of the best critiques of socialism. But there was one a while back that I wrote on capitalism and socialism, and today I wanted to address that for just a few minutes. Even though we won't be addressing that in a future Outlook magazine, there is a real concern with the fact that some of the reasons people accept socialism is because they have a false idea about capitalism. And Roger Kimball titles it The Evils of Capitalism. He says, what's the one thing everyone knows about capitalism? Why, well, it started out as a mean, nasty tool of greedy industrialists, of course. The Industrial Revolution, we all learned, was a terrible Moloch that devoured children, put profits before people, and though it made great fortunes, was wicked development. The Industrial Revolution, we've all been taught, was the original sin of capitalism, necessary perhaps to prime the energy of economic progress, but lamentable nevertheless. He goes on to say, ask anyone, the Industrial Revolution is a stigma that no amount of social amelioration can remove. The factory system, an integral part of the Industrial Revolution, was an urban nightmare, a Dickensian melodrama in which the rural innocence was mauled and blighted in these satanic mills. And where did these ideas come from? Well, he points out that these come from Frederick Engels. You might say, who is Frederick Engels? Well, Karl Marx and Frederick Engels both wrote the Communist Manifesto. So Engels certainly was an individual that provided not only some of the intellectual firepower, but some of the financial basis as well for the communist revolution. And he wrote what Roger Kimball calls a fairy tale called The Condition of the Working Class in England in 1844. Now, first of all, let's acknowledge that when you move people from the farms to factories and you had machinery and you had poor working conditions, nobody's saying this was wonderful, but in some respects is what he says, this sad story that was told at the time, and even points out that no less than somebody like Bertrand Russell, who certainly probably knew better, kind of bought into it as well. And then also, as Friedrich Hayek, you might say, who is he? Well, he's the individual that we quote in this particular booklet on the road to serfdom. In his book, Capitalism and Historians, basically pointed out that the widespread emotional aversion to capitalism is closely connected with this belief that the undeniable growth of wealth, which the competitive order had produced, was purchased at the price of depressing the standard of life and the weakest of society. And basically, he points out, without going into all the details, that this whole narrative that came from certainly, first of all, Friedrich Engels and then later Bertrand Russell is, as he said, a tissue of exaggerations, misrepresentations, and outright lies. And one of the things that Friedrich von Hayek was trying to do was clarify that. But today you have, of course, the incoming mayor in New York City, Zohran Mamdani, saying taxation isn't theft, capitalism is. And this idea that we want to get rid of the capitalist origins because it caused such great hardship and the rest. And yet, if you think about this, if you go through the actual study, it was something that lifted the standard of living dramatically for the people at the time. It's also, interestingly enough, and Roger Kimball points out that even the phrase Industrial Revolution was coined, and I did not know this, not by English industrialists, but French writers who were actually writing against the idea of industrialization. And he says that the early 19th century, according to the conventional wisdom, was a time of great economic oppression. In fact, it was a time of great progress and wealth creation, the like of which the world had never seen before. Was there squalor and misery and poverty in the early 19th century? He says, of course. And a lot of that was abetted by poor government policy. They had, for example, at the time, a window tax. Because of that, many of these factories were made without windows, and it was the government that made a problem worse. But the truth is that after 1820, the standard of living rapidly improved in British society. And if you've ever looked at any of those charts, and I have some of that in my booklet in which we refer to it in the history of cycles, you can see that is the case. So he points out that, again, von Hayek, in his Capitalism and Historians, was a very helpful historical corrective and full of some really important issues that need to be expressed today, which he says brings me to my final point. Not a day goes by without lamentations from the evils or limitations of capitalism emitted by some of capitalism's most conspicuous beneficiaries. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for example, is full of such statements, as are, if no member of the Democratic Party. And it is, I think, back to what we talked about yesterday, in which we are sort of living in somewhat of a golden age. Yes, there are problems we need to address, but on this Thanksgiving week, maybe we should be grateful for the fact that we have an incredible standard of living, and some of that, quite frankly, was brought about by the Industrial Revolution, also brought about by major advances in science and medicine and the rest. And he says, despite this anti-capitalist narrative, however, a narrative we hear repeatedly by progressive politicians and reiterated by many other academics, is the capital system has been paid possible over the last century, and especially the last few decades, the greatest accumulation of wealth in the history of the world. At one data point, the Dow Jones Index was at 700. Today, it's at 46,000. So if nothing else, this is, I think, a very good antidote. And, of course, if you wanted to go back and read von Hayek's book on Capitalism and Historians, you would see that this is just one of those myths that just keeps getting repeated. And even though it's repeated, it's not really based on fact. We're going to spend the next couple of months from time to time, either on the air or, of course, in an upcoming issue of Outlook, talking about this issue of socialism, talking about some of the problems with socialism, and then eventually maybe even talking about how to counter some of these unfair criticisms of capitalism and the free market, recognizing we've never had a true, perfect free market, but maybe that's something we could look forward to in the future as well. That's all we have for this first hour. Next hour, we're going to get into, of course, the history of African Americans in this country from its beginning all the way up to a current situation, and we'll certainly try to get as much of the facts and figures and information out. But if you find yourself saying, I'd like to read it for myself, this is a book that we've made available on our website today. Just scroll down and you will see that we have made it available to you. If you'd like to get it in hardcover or paperback or Kindle, it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up. But we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
You know, as we talk about the 250th anniversary of this country, we certainly recognize we need to tell all the history, and part of that is a history of African Americans. And it seems to me that we do understand that there are dark chapters in American history, and that's one of those. But sometimes those have been misrepresented, and I think it is important to try to clarify that. And so that's why I decided to pull one of these books off my shelf that's been there for a while by Robert Woodson. He's actually the editor of about 24 essays in this book called Red, White, and Black: Rescuing American History from Revisionist and Race Hustlers. It was a #1 bestseller. By the way, he has a new one, A Pathway to American Renewal, Red, White, and Black as well. But if you're not familiar with Robert Woodson, let me just mention that he is the founder and president of the Woodson Center. Also, 1776 Unites. We'll talk more about what that means in just a minute. His social activism goes all the way back back to the 1960s when he was a young civil rights activist. In the 1970s, he directed the National Urban League's Administration of Justice Division. Later, he served even as a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. But we've had him on oftentimes to talk about this 1776 project and 1776 Unite. So, Robert Woodson, welcome back to Point of View.
Always a pleasure to share with you.
And again, 200 pages, 24 essays by a good number of individuals like Wilfred Riley and Carol Swain and others that we've quoted like John McWhorter and Clarence Page and Shelby Steele and a variety of others. But let's get into it, because obviously right now people are looking back to 1776, and they're also looking back even before that, especially when you get closer to Thanksgiving. We talk about 1620, but how about 1619? There seems to be such an attempt now with the 1619 project to say that America was founded on slavery and that even the American Revolution was fought to keep slavery legal. But that's not true, is it?
No, it isn't. In fact, in 2019, Nicole Hannah-Jones, a black journalist with the New York Times, published a series of essays by black journalists that she called 1619, and she tried to frame the American experience by America's birth defect of slavery, saying that America's founding is really in 1619 when the first 20 indentured servants came here. And so since she was using this to define America as a racist nature, and therefore all whites are villains and all blacks are victims. And so since the messenger was black, we thought that the counter message should also be black. So I got together some black scholars and activists, and we wanted to publish a rebuttal to it, but we didn't want to engage in gladiatorial debate. We wanted to offer an alternative narrative that was inspirational and aspirational, that told the truth. Yes, America, no one should be defined by the worst of what we were in our past. No one. And so I think it's important to tell the truth about slavery, but slavery does not define America. America is a country of redemption. America is a country of second chances. And so our scholars got busy, and we went back and published these essays that talk. So America's black can never be defined by slavery or Jim Crow. We talked about what was our response to oppression, and we talked about in this essays that, according to one of our scholars, we looked at the state of marriage. That he looked at the records of 6 plantations that covered thousands of slaves. 75% of those slave households had a man and a woman raising children. So nuclear family, even in slavery, was central to the survival of African Americans. And this marriage, nuclear marriage, would define Black America for over 100 years. And when we were denied access to hotels or after slavery, we built our own. We were only 10% of freed slaves were literate. And within 40 years, that number had increased to 70%, done not by what the government did, but by the churches setting up schools on Saturday to teach released slaves. So America is a history, is defined, again, not by slavery or Jim Crow, but by the ways that blacks responded to it, using the various principles and values and virtues of the American experience.
One of the things that I found very helpful in one of the chapters by John McWhorter is he says, we cannot allow 1619 to dumb down America in the name of a crusade. And as he goes through here, he points out it isn't just saying that slavery was coming to this country in 1619, or that this was how we founded the country, or whatever. But it goes all the way through. For example, on one point it points out Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation doesn't matter because, after all, he was a white person. So you find that it almost begins to take the other. We don't want to whitewash American history, but in this case, we don't want to condemn everything in American history. And once you start with that starting point, any action done, even if it was a good and positive action, is quickly dismissed, isn't it?
It really is. But also, I argue this on the Dr. Phil show about reparations.
Okay.
There were 3,000 freed slaves that owned 13,000 black slaves. The question is, do the descendants of these free blacks that were slave owners, do they pay? In 1850, on the Fugitive Slave Act, there was a big a group in Toledo, Ohio, led by 3 black barbers and 1,200 white farmers and 2 Indian tribes, and they formed an underground railroad that enabled 50,000 blacks to escape from slavery into Canada, and they didn't lose a single person. So when you're talking about the American experience, you have to be much more inclusive. These 1,200 white farmers risked their lives to free slaves. So America is not defined as Nicole Hannah-Jones, that all whites are villains and all whites and blacks are victims.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, I'm going to get into that a little bit more, because one of the articles by Wilfred Riley, Slavery Does Not Define the Black American Experience. I want to get into that. Of course, the whole issue of victimization. It's all part of this book. It's been out for many years, but I just thought I would mention it again, and we've made it possible, even if you can't find it in your local bookstore, to actually get a hardback copy or a paperback copy or even a Kindle. And it is edited by Robert Woodson as our guest, and it has a series of essays that really help us understand more of the American history from a black perspective, and also helps maybe set aside some of the myths and mythology, really, that sometimes accompanies all that. So we'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Thanksgiving is tomorrow, and I suspect that you are doing lots of things to get ready for this special day. Let me suggest you add one more item to your to-do list. Visit our website and download a copy of my Thanksgiving quiz. Thanksgiving is a wonderful time to gather as a family, but I also believe that it can be a great time to teach our children and grandchildren about America's godly heritage. I created this short quiz to be a conversation starter around the Thanksgiving table. You know, we used to go around the table before the meal and ask our children to tell us what they were thankful for. After a few years of hearing about how they were thankful for their cat, their doll, their video games, I knew we needed to do something else. The Thanksgiving quiz was born out of that frustration. It has 19 questions and answers on the Pilgrims and the Mayflower Compact, as well as some questions and answers about the Christian heritage of America. Who were the Pilgrims, and why did they leave Europe for America? Why did they celebrate Thanksgiving? What is the Mayflower Compact, and why is it significant? What lessons did the Pilgrims learn about work and even free enterprise? How did the Christian faith influence America? These are just a few of the sort of questions that you can ask around the table and give short answers. Perhaps it is time to recapture the importance of Thanksgiving. On the bicentennial celebration of the landing of the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock, Daniel Webster declared the following: "Let us not forget the religious character of our origin. Our fathers were brought hither by their high veneration for the Christian religion. They journeyed by its light and labored in its hope, and they sought to incorporate its principles with the elements of their society and diffuse its influence through all their institutions, civil, political, or literary." It is my hope that this quiz will help your family see the importance of Thanksgiving. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Robert Woodson. Again, just mentioning the book Red, White, and Black. If you'd like to know more, okay, we have information about that on our website. But Robert, one of the particular essays by Wilfred Riley, and we've quoted him before, even had him on the program, was "Slavery does not define the Black American experience." Now, of course, all of your authors are African American, I believe, but nevertheless, he recognizes that there is a real need to honestly talk about the slave trade, talk about how Congress wanted to actually prevent it from continuing. It was even a line that was originally in the Declaration of Independence but taken out, and then, of course, led to ultimately the Civil War and all sorts of other actions because we were dealing with everything from segregation to Jim Crow. But take us back to that, because it does seem to me that we should acknowledge it as our history, learn from that, but if it is still being brought up in 2025, maybe it's time to recognize that that's a part of our history and the history of a lot of other countries, but it shouldn't define who we are, should it?
No, it shouldn't. And the people who are raising it today and the way they're doing it, they're weaponizing it. They're using it as a bludgeon against the country that has nothing to do with the reality of our history. I'm really disappointed that the civil rights movement is part and parcel responsible for this misuse of our history. It's unfortunate that it has devolved into a race grievance industry, and so you can't look to there for any leadership. And that's why I brought together independent Black thinkers in action who can look honestly at our past. Again, our founders, half of our founders, were slave owners, but just because they were their actions were contradictory to their espoused principles, the principles were certainly above the actions of its authors. And I believe it was divinely inspired, because why would people establish principles that hold their own behavior suspect? And the very fact that Black Americans have fought in every war that this country has executed, every war, because we believe in these founding principles. And so we highlight those in our essays. Again, it's important to tell the truth and be candid about it, but at the same time, we should not permit people to define us by the worst of what we used to be. Whenever I speak to groups, I ask people to hold up their hands. How many would like to be defined by the least of what they were? It's like every time the Apostle Paul spoke, you say, yeah, but you used to be Saul.
Good line. And for just a minute, since you did say that in passing, not only were many of the founders slave owners, but interestingly enough, we had a conversation recently with a historian who was pointing out that even though there was an abolition movement, we had the First Great Awakening and slavery remained legal. It still remained legal during the Second Great Awakening, but at least then the abolitionist movement was really a part and parcel of that. And he points it out that even Jonathan Edwards supported this idea of slavery. George Whitefield, in one way, had connections to slavery. So in some respects, it was so much a part of the cultural moment that they hadn't really thought through how you would apply biblical principles about human dignity in that time. And maybe, don't you think, Robert, that's a warning to us today that maybe we have some blind spots as well when we get to some of these issues?
Yeah, but I don't think we should be defined by so-called blind spots. I think that we need to be aware of it, but we shouldn't be defined by it. There's the old adage that the rearview mirror is small.
Well said.
And we don't need to be looking back. You can, and because we have too much to celebrate. You see, people are motivated to change and to improve when you show them victories that are possible. The biggest crisis that we have in America today is not racial. We have a grace problem, not a race problem. That the leading cause of death of our young people, it is homicide for blacks in the inner city, prescription drugs for Appalachian whites, and even in Silicon Valley, where the median income is like $190,000, two-parent households, suicide rate among teens is 6 times the national average.
Wow.
So we have a moral and spiritual crisis that is consuming our young people. And perhaps if we keep telling our young people that they live in a country that hates them, that they're either a villain or a victim, perhaps they begin to accept this characterization of themselves, and it affects their quality of life.
Yes.
And so we must be careful that we should focus our attentions on the critical crisis facing, but we won't do it if we have to look at it through a racial lens.
Let's, if we can, talk about hope for just a minute. Yeah, because one of the things you talk about in 1776 Unites, and you've got a piece by Reverend Corey Brooks, the history of 1776 offers hope for all Americans. And it does seem to me, Robert, that's what you're talking about. We have a whole generation that is hopeless. They're just so convinced that they live in an evil, racist, bigoted society where the economic opportunities are few and none. And it does seem to me that that's what you're trying to counter with the whole idea of focusing on 1776. Can you explain that?
Absolutely. In other words, people are motivated to change and improve their lives when you show them victories that are possible, not injuries to be avoided. And you have that America's founded. I support an organization where we have 3,500 low-income grassroots leaders in 39 states. I think there are new patriots. In all of the 44 years that I've had the center, when we convene at conventions and retreats, even though we're multiracial and multi-ethnic, racial animus never comes up one time, because people who are legitimately struggling are more concerned about overcoming the brokenness in their lives, drug addiction, abuse. And they use the principles of our founders as the foundation upon which they rebuild their lives. And so it's most important for us to move beyond race, and so that we can address the crisis and meaning in the lives of our children. A lot of our children are lacking a content and meaning to their lives, and therefore, if you devalue your life, you will take your own or you will take someone else's. They're different sides of the same coin.
So again, we're talking about this book, Red, White, and Black, Rescuing American History. And when we come back from the break, Robert, I thought we might focus on a wonderful kind of hopeful story from Carol Swine, because, again, she is an individual that grew up in poverty, and I'll read some of that. And then, of course, has her doctorate and has been on various programs, including this program, and on various movies and documentaries and the rest. And so it's just an illustration that you can indeed overcome some of the difficulties that result in maybe feeling that you are a victim, instead of recognizing that you can look at some of these issues from a positive point of view. And then I'll pick out just maybe one or two other very important issues that are in this book. But if you find yourself wanting to know a little bit more about American history, and especially the place of Black America, African Americans in contemporary society, and how to maybe to resist some of these campaigns that have come out recently that have given a much more politicized view, whether it's the 1619 Project, whether it is the idea that we should seek reparations, whether it is that we are in a country that is riven with racism and bigotry. These are some ideas that I think we need to be able to address as well. And so again, as I mentioned, this book, about 200 pages, about 24 different essays by kind of a who's who of individuals addressing this, trying to answer the question about whether or not not America was founded as a racist nation, whether we're dealing with systemic oppression, and how to maybe bring about some kind of reconciliation. So I think you're going to find the resource very helpful. And as we also have provided in the past, we do have a link so that if you would like to contact the material that is available at the Woodson Center, you can go to woodsonCenter.org. As a matter of fact, you might want to go to that during the break. You can find out more about, of course, the 1776 Unites, even the Voices of Black Mothers United, and much more. It's all available on our website, and we'll be back with more right after this.
I have a little nutcracker decoration that counts down the days, and it tells me that Thanksgiving and Christmas are coming fast. But you know, so is another special day, Giving Tuesday, December 2nd. People around the world are going to take part in this annual tradition of showing generosity in the middle of a season that's often marked by busyness and consumerism. It is so easy to focus on what we need in our own life, but I encourage you, pray about what you can give this Giving Tuesday and consider partnering with Point of View. By partnering with Point of View this Giving Tuesday, you'll be part of a mission to give truth to America in a time when it's desperately needed. Mark your calendar so you don't forget to give on Giving Tuesday, December 2nd. Or you can give anytime by visiting us online at pointofview.net or calling 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net, and 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again talking about the book Red, White, and Black with Robert Woodson, and just some of the things that are happening at his organization as well. If you'd like to know more about the Woodson Center or about this book, all available at the website pointofview.net. I thought for just a minute we might just talk about this piece by Dr. Carol Swain. She's been on the program with us before, and here's a good illustration of an individual that if you met her now, she was an associate professor for a while at Princeton, but probably best known as being the political science professor and law professor at Vanderbilt University. First book she published was with Harvard University Press. You would think, well, what a successful woman. Now let me tell you the rest of the story, because she says, I grew up in the country woods of southwestern Virginia, a family that eventually included 12 children. I was the second oldest. My earliest childhood memories include living in a tar paper covered 2-room shack without indoor plumbing or running water. Points out that that's where you had the cooking stove. Many years the children slept on the kitchen floor. The poverty I experienced meant that water for bathing each morning had to be heated on the stove and shared with others. Water for cooking, bathing, and cleaning came from the spring located downhill from a cemetery. We lacked proper clothes. If it snowed, they tended to stay home. Once we missed 80 out of 180 school days, and my siblings and I failed. So if you are familiar with the rest of her story, poverty, getting married at a young age, having already dropped out of school, eventually getting her GED, having people tell her that she has potential, that maybe she's intelligent. Of course, now she has 5 college degrees. But Robert, she talks about the fact that one of the things that kept her going was the recognition that everyone has potential to overcome life's disadvantages. Where you start your life does not determine where you end up. And your attitude towards life is more important even than your circumstances. And so her particular essay in there is just a reminder that we don't need to keep this culture of victimhood going. We need to give people hope, and that's really what you're trying to do through the Woodson Center, isn't it?
We really are, and I think it's what Pastor Chuck Swindoll argued in his book. He said, 10% of who we are is defined by external circumstances, the kind of conditions you just identified with Carl Swain, abuse that have occurred. But 90% of who we are is the attitude about the 10%. And so that Carl Swain is a perfect example of that. But in the book, we also tell the story of Robert Smalls, who was born into slavery, found himself working on a Southern supply ship as a crew, one of 6 members of the crew. And when the captain went ashore for dinner with the rest of the crew, he commandeered the ship, picked up his family and members of the other, and put on the captain's hat and gave signals and went past 5 different Southern garrisons and turned the ship over to the Union Navy. He was celebrated and met with President Lincoln, and because of his heroism, he was made a first black captain in the Navy, but also it encouraged Lincoln to let blacks fight in the Union Civil War. Robert Smalls fought in there, and after the war, he became a wealthy businessman, served in Congress for 10 terms. He went back and purchased a plantation on which he was a slave, and took in the wife of the slave owner who became demented and poor, and allowed her to continue to sleep in her bedroom. This, to me, is an act of radical grace.
Yes. And just one of those many kinds of stories that I really wish children knew today, because when we start talking about what they do know, all they really sometimes hear is the negative, and they don't hear about, I don't know, Frederick Douglass or George Washington Carver or Harriet Tubman or something like that. These are stories which, even though we have what is oftentimes referred to as Black History Month, sometimes those stories, which I think would be of encouragement to young people, simply don't get taught. And that's why I think what you're doing and what others are trying to do to maybe instill some hope in a culture that has been told that they're victims and facing oppressive actions, systemic racism, and the rest, we're not going to help them succeed in the future.
Well, the good news is we've developed a school curriculum from these essays that has been downloaded in all 50 states almost 500,000 times. We also have a series of seven-minute animations where we take like characters like Robert Smalls and others, and those have been downloaded almost by 3 million people on YouTube. And so we really think there is a thirst in the American public for a real history, an accurate history of America. And Carl Swain is a perfect example of how even today people are taking those old values and applying them to their new reality. But that's what we at the Woodson Center encourage everybody to do. We must be encouraged, and we should turn away from the naysayers and the race hustlers, and instead unite in addressing the challenges that we face today. I'll tell you another interesting story that people enjoy, that there was a man, Elijah McCoy, who was born of fugitive slave parents, who went to Canada, and he became an engineer and went to work for the Chicago Railroad. And because he was black, even though he had an engineering degree, he was given the most dangerous and the lowest level job of oiling the wheels on the trains. Well, he used his lowly position to invent a machine that automatically lubricates the engines, and he is now in the Inventors Hall of Fame and became very wealthy. When other people tried to develop knockoffs, the owners of the railroad said, no, we want the real McCoy.
That's where the phrase comes from. Just before I take a break here, I did want to mention, some people say, you just mentioned the curriculum, but where do we find it? So you go to the woodsoncenter.org, and then there's a drop-down menu, how we can help, and how we help, and there's one called curriculum. And then when you click on there, it gives you all sorts of ideas of, you can see some of the material that we've already talked about here, and what it includes. There's a QR code if you want to download it. Maybe you have it on your phone, or else you want to click on some of it and pull it off. So this is, again, at the Woodson Center, and it's a curriculum. And again, that is, I think, just a great illustration of we can sit here and be critical. It's the old, you can curse the darkness or you can light some lamps, and you've been doing that for some time. So one other one I want to put on the table, since you're sort of talking about some of these great stories, Clarence Page, of course, we've talked about him before on this program, talks about why black patriotism is more important than victimization. Right now, Robert, one of the concerns I have is we don't seem to have the same kind of patriotism. You and I are old enough to remember that when we have the bicentennial in 1976, there was a lot of patriotism. And now here it is 250 years, and 50 years later, I'm wondering where some of the patriotism has gone. And it does seem to me that whether it's in the black community or the white community or Americans in general, we need to come back to some of these patriotic ideas, don't you think?
We really do. But I also think it's a class phenomenon. So a young friend of mine, Delano Squires, he said that, and I quote him, that the narrative that's condemnatory of American values is really driven by an elite set of guilty whites who are seeking absolution from crimes they never committed, and a small group of elite blacks who are seeking absolution from injustices they never suffered. They are the ones who are pushing this bipolar debate. But I think the majority of black Americans are patriotic, and they do not agree with this race grievance agenda. If you look at the polling, where 80% of blacks do not support defund the police, 60% of blacks polled do not believe that racial discrimination is the biggest barrier to their flourishing. So a lot of the reporting on the attitudes and polls do not reflect blacks who are in the situation that are in the most dire circumstances.
That is good. Let's take a break, and we'll come back. Just a final comment or two, which we'll get from Robert Woodson. If you find yourself saying, I would like to know more about the Woodson Center, I'd like to know more about the book, Red, White, and Black, we have all of it available at our website, pointofview.net. Go and check it out, even during the break, and we'll come back with more right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Robert Woodson with us for a few more minutes as we talk about his book, Red, White, and Black. And Robert, I would be remiss if we didn't talk about the nature of the black family. And you write in your introduction, until the 1960s, poverty did not entail social dysfunction in the black community. In the 10 years, even of the Great Depression, the United States overall had a negative GDP and nearly 25% unemployment rate, and the unemployment rate in the black community was over 40%, which is unbelievable. And then the marriage rate in the black community was actually higher than in the white community. In 1925, for example, 85% of black families had a husband and wife raising their children. Today, the rate of out-of-wedlock births among blacks has skyrocketed to nearly 71%. Now, part of that happened because of the so-called Great Society programs, but part of it happened because of a program instituted by Cloward and Piven. These were professors at Columbia, and it does seem to me that some of what has happened to the African-American community in this last century is as devastating as some of the things that happened before. Can you speak to that?
Black America was better off the first 100 years after slavery than we've been the last 60 years. Let me repeat that. That Black Americans were better off the first 100 years after slavery than we have been in the last 60 years. I was born in 1937, right in the midst of Depression, in a small black blue-collar neighborhood in South Philadelphia. 98% of the households had a man and a woman raising children. Elderly people could walk safely without fear of being assaulted by their children. Children were not shot in their cribs. And that's because of our strong Christian faith and also the family. But all of that disintegrated in the 60s when, as you said, two scholars at the Columbia University School of Social Work created a theory that they said the way you deal with poverty is to flood the system with welfare, that we should bankrupt the system by flooding them with welfare recipients so that we can redistribute income, that we can separate. If you flood the system with welfare recipients, it'll separate work from income, and you will see a decline. And they did that, but they couldn't. Just having a theory wasn't enough. They were assisted by the federal government that opened anti-poverty offices in all major cities, where people were recruited into the welfare system. And the Black Power movement also contributed by defining the nuclear family as being Eurocentric and racist. And then the women's movement contributed by demonizing fathers. So you had a combination of government action and also cultural institutions directing their attention at separating work from income. And when that happened, the predictable occurred, that out-of-wedlock births, drug addiction, school dropout rates, crime, violence. So it was really the social policies and actions of the 60s, urban renewal, that wiped out centers of Black economic success, such as the Hayti section of Durham. And all major Black communities had an economic center that was the center of economic life. Those were destroyed by government policy. So you have these combinations of forces that occurred that they were supposed to help with the help, and they were injuring with the helping hand. And I document this in this book.
You know what I'm thinking is, especially as we're talking about the solution, you really have a war of two different curricula. You have the 1619 Project, which has kind of the push behind the New York Times and others, which has disseminated that school curricula. And then you have yours, which, again, I want to point to woodsonCenter.org, and then just go to How We Help, and then the curriculum, because you have all sorts of opportunities here to present Black history, character development, and a variety of others. And I'm hoping that even our listeners that or maybe have children going to schools that are predominantly white would have access to this as well, because it's the kind of material that certainly should be shared, because, again, African Americans are part of our American history. We have both sad and very destructive aspects of that, but we also have some incredibly positive stories as well. And those are, in a sense, are the battle that's taking place right now in the schools for the souls of the next generation, don't you think?
It is. We have to also realize there are 2 million Black millionaires in America.
Amazing.
Not all Blacks are suffering equally. It's more of a class phenomenon than it is a race phenomenon. And but again, we have examples of how communities have been restored. And how schools, we support the Pineywood School, the 116-year-old residential program that is Christian-based in Pineywood, Mississippi, 20 miles from Jackson. And there, kids from some of these very challenged neighborhoods, single-parent households, 100% of them graduate and go on to college, proving that when you put children into a life-affirming environment, where values Judeo-Christian values are taught, that they can flourish the way blacks did in the past. So we have to just create circumstances where the environment supports and encourages moral excellence.
Well, again, if people want to know more about some of the different outreaches that you have, of course, I mentioned just in passing the Voices of Black Mothers United Community Affiliate Network, of course, the anniversary. If they would like to get more about the curriculum, if they would like to get on your email list, if they'd like to have you come and speak, or just maybe learn some of the stories, maybe even watch some of the videos that you have available there, it's all available at woodsoncenter.org. And so, Robert, I just, as always, thank you for the work that you're doing, and I thank you for taking the time to put together this book as well as all the material available at the Woodson Center. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
And thank you, and happy Thanksgiving to your listeners.
Well, let me just, before we run out of time, mention again that this is an attempt to maybe help you understand that we have a history that we need to certainly account for. But at the same time, we also recognize that there is what oftentimes is referred to as almost kind of a contemporary group think about race, about class, about American history. As we pointed out, there are some stories that I think could be very encouraging to you. This also has some great opportunity to criticize and critique some of the things that are being presented, especially through the 1619 Project. And so if you wanted to know more about the 1776 Unites Project, it's an attempt to really have a special focus on some of the voices in the black community, to celebrate black excellence, to reject this victimhood culture, and really kind of showcase the millions of African Americans who have prospered by embracing some of these foundational ideals of America. So it's a great resource, and it's one more resource that we put on our Point of View website so that you can find out more. You can find some of the articles related to this. You can find the book. And, of course, you can also find the link that we have provided to Robert Woodson at the woodsoncenter.org. As I mentioned at the outset, I want to thank both Megans for being in here today, Megan Anderson and Megan Kitchen. Certainly want to thank you for making this possible. And also, as he wanted to also encourage you to do, wish you a happy Thanksgiving. Enjoy Thanksgiving. We will run a tape on Friday, but we'll be back here Monday right here on Point of View talking about issues in the news. We'll see you then.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer. And that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.